Good day, everyone. This is the recording, the mini lecture recording for Chapter 2 of the Organizational Change, Development, and Transformation book. This is also called Session 1.2. And today we are going to be learning about change models. So particularly, we're going to be focusing on about 5 change models that organizational development practitioners use to basically implement change in typical organizations. All right, first question I'd like to ask is basically who is responsible for change? When an organization realizes that they need to change the way they behave, the way they do business, what does an organization usually do? First of all, it's important for us to note that organizations want to plan for change. Transformation is very abrupt, and oftentimes, as we explained in the previous lecture, it's very difficult to plan for a transformation, and usually a transformation happens very abruptly. And what we actually want, what most organizations want, is a more planned and orderly change process, so that we can measure how effective we are, and we are able to basically implement a change without any long-term damage. And when I say long-term damage here, we know that change can be very stressful for many employees, and oftentimes change can mean employees resigning. So oftentimes an organization does not want its employees, of course, to resign. What they want is to be able to, for their employees to be actually deal with this change and work with it to become more effective. So again, plan change is there. We do it in order to increase an organization's effectiveness. And this change is often initiated by managers, whether within the organization, and OD, or organizational development practitioners. Now, these practitioners can be people from within the organizations, people with experience in implementing change. They could be part of the human resource department, or they could be specialists that have been hired, like consultants that have been hired from outside of the company. In fact, that's an occupation that's quite popular and very sought after. People who are very good at implementing change are what we call OD practitioners. All right, so remember that organizations use planned change to solve problems. It's probably the most common use of organizational change. And an example of a problem that an organization might encounter is poor product quality. So you might have this wonderful mobile smartphone, but if it conks out every 6 months, or after 6 months the product is no longer usable, then you might say this is a problem that we need to solve if you were that company. So the other reason why organizations use planned change is to learn from experience. So an example of this is your customers will often give you suggestions and recommendations to improve your product. And this is based on their own experience in using your product. How do you implement those customer suggestions in a holistic way to make sure that all aspects of the business are actually using these inputs from customers? That involves actually changing the process within the organization. Okay, another reason why organizations might use planned change is to adapt to a particular external environmental change. So a perfect example is the coronavirus, this crisis that we are currently undergoing. And as I explained to you before, it's really more of a transformation for many organizations. But there might be an opportunity for us to learn from this. There might be an opportunity for us to plan better for, say, the next few terms of the organization, of the school. And therefore, we could do some sort of an OD intervention or an organizational development plan or project to try to implement how do we react to a situation where we have to do more online classes. So obviously this involves training students on how to use the online systems, as well as training the staff on how to use the online systems. Another reason to use plan change is to simply improve performance. There may not be a problem in the organization. It may simply be the CEO realizes that, we are producing this much profit, and we want to increase our profit by 20%. And how do we go about improving that performance? So an example of this might be learning and implementing a new productivity software. So many organizations use software to improve the way they operate. It could be a customer relations software where we store data about the customer, and how can we use this information to sell our products in a better way to our employees, to our customers. So that's an example of a productivity software. And how do you implement that software given that we may have a completely an old and a completely different system in place? People have to get used to the new software to replace the old software, and that takes a change program. All right, we'll be learning about 5 models today, namely Lewin's change model, the action research model, the positive model, the ProSci ADKAR model, and last but not least, the contingency model of plan change. So let's go on and talk about Lewin's change model. So Kurt Lewin is seen as the father of organizational change, of basically how organizations study and deal with change. And he came up with this very early model that is called the force field analysis model, or many practitioners simply call it Lewin's model of change. So Kurt Lewin said that there are basically 2 forces at work when we're trying to implement a change. The first is what we call the driving force. These are the efforts that we put in if we are, for example, the owner of a business, and we're trying to implement change in the workplace. For example, again, a new software, or learning some rules and regulations, etc. But then, more often than not, there is what we call a restraining force. It's just a natural occurrence for most people to resist change. If we are used to doing something and we're faced with we're forced to change into some sort of a new procedure, it's not unusual, and in fact, we should expect that most employees will sort of have really don't want to implement that change, and employees will often come up with reasons and come up with an explanation of why they don't like this change. More often than not, you'll have this kind of reaction as opposed to people welcoming change. It's not usual that employees will welcome something new. Again, a great example would be for you students now learning online. How did you find learning online versus learning on a face-to-face method? I'm sure many of you felt that there were certain disadvantages in learning online, and that is what we call a resistance to change. There's nothing really wrong with that. In fact, managers should use this resistance to change as a way of learning how we can implement change in a better way. So as I said, there are 2 forces involved. One that is pushing downwards and the other that's pushing up, meaning we want to make a change while there are people saying, no, I don't want a change. So the objective, therefore, of a manager is to create more force in this driving force and push this restraining force, to try to reduce that restraining force. And basically the real challenge is in how do we reduce this restraining force? And we'll get into that at a later time. So Lewin further went on and said there are basically 3 stages when we're trying to implement a change. And he likened this to a block of ice, a giant block of ice that managers are trying to basically thaw out. They're trying to unfreeze this block of ice to make sure that we can implement the change. So whatever we're doing, the old ways of doing things are inside that block of ice. It's frozen and it doesn't move. It just maintains the old procedure. And people don't, in fact, want to change this block of ice. They just want it to maintain constant. So if we unfreeze that block of ice, then we can start to move things inside that block of ice. In other words, this is when we can change procedures. How do we unfreeze that block of ice? Figuratively speaking, of course, it's basically unfreezing, is we actually try to give the reasons why we want to enact a change. So we don't just say to the employees, okay, guys, we've got a new software. You have to use it. I won't explain to you why we want to use this software. It's simply because, I want to do it, and you basically have to do it. So you can imagine how employees will sort of turn around and say, why are we being forced to do this new change? A great example would be, again, you guys are working online. If we had just simply said to you guys, to you students, okay, from now on, we won't have any face-to-face. We're going to have online sessions. And if you don't understand the situation and you don't realize that we're doing this because the government has actually asked us to do it, the government has actually said we need to try to isolate ourselves to avoid infection of this virus. If people didn't understand that, they would probably resist this move. They would say, I don't want to go online. I refuse to go online. So part of that, again, is explaining why. That's really important. I want to stress that over and over again in this unit. So when we unfreeze the block of ice, we can now do some movement. In other words, actually implement a transition between the old system and the new system. And the way we would do that is usually through training. If you now are in agreement that, yes, you want to learn how to go online, therefore, we will enact some training sessions for you, the students, so that you can actually move from face-to-face to online. After that, assuming we want this new system to stay in place for a longer period, then we need to do refreezing. So whatever new procedures that we've been able to do, we need to now freeze it back in so that people don't forget and they don't go back to the old ways. So imagine if we're still having this virus crisis, and yes, you learn how to do online, but because of habit, you still end up going back to school, and you're looking for your teacher. Where's my teacher, right? That's because you've forgotten that we are doing things online. Okay, so here's Lewin's change model and basically the aspects of what we are expected to do at each stage. Again, during stage one, and we're trying to unfreeze things. In other words, we're trying to create motivation for people to want to change. We need to create what we call a dissatisfaction. So we need to explain why this current situation is not acceptable. So obviously for you students, realizing that we can't do face-to-face, because if we do, we're likely to transmit the virus and create some more sick people. So that's the dissatisfaction that we're trying to create. And we're saying, okay, because of that situation, we need to go online, right? So the other example might be in an organization, they might have some performance standards that people are not meeting. So product quality might be here, but we're trying to aim for a higher level of quality. And then we explain to employees, the gap between where we are and where we want to be in terms of product quality. So that's an example of an internal barrier, and that we want to overcome. So once we explain what we're trying to do, we hopefully will cause an unfreeze and move into what you call a transition phase, or the moving phase. And this is where, as I said before, we train people in the new skills on how we can implement this change and basically actually enact or achieve the goals that we want to achieve. And again, the third stage is refreezing. So how do we make sure that people don't go back and regress and do the same things, the same old bad habits that you used to have? Well, first of all, we need to, usually we need to reward people. If you're doing the right thing, we'll give you a reward. It might be a promotion, it might be as simple as a one-time bonus, or it could be a recognition that you have done a great job, you've learned this new system. We also need to measure things. We need to measure how well we've actually implemented this new system. Is the new system actually working? For example, if we've implemented an online learning system, are you students, are you actually learning from all these things? And a good control measure would be an exam. So if we do an exam and more people are failing in this process, for online process, it gives us an idea that we are actually failing in this process. So that's an example of a control procedure. Okay, action research approach is a slightly different approach, and the principles behind this approach are the following. Firstly, there is action. It's basically we're trying to change behavior, trying to change attitudes and behavior to achieve a goal. And secondly, the way we change attitudes and behavior is by using data, or in other words, we need to figure out what the situation really is by researching the situation. So another example of research is a survey. So if I'm trying to diagnose why the company is doing so poorly, I might do an employee survey and ask the employees, what do you think is the reason why we are performing poorly? That sort of information is something a manager can use to design a change program. So these are the principles behind action research. It's an open systems perspective. It understands that each system is connected to another system within an organization. It's highly participative. It means that we need to involve employees. Those that are affected by change need to be involved in the planning and implementing of change. It is very data-driven. In other words, we don't just say, I think the problem is like this. It's actually driven by research. We need to find the scientific reason why a problem is occurring through the use of employee surveys, interviews, a careful analysis of data for the organization. And it's important to note that there are feedback loops. In other words, we use this information that we're gathering, we constantly gather information before and after we implement change. So if we're implementing change, we need to measure, is the change working? We do another analysis, another step in checking to see whether change is happening. And then we use this data to inform our next step. So we look at our next step when we say, it is working, therefore we maintain the actions that we're doing. Or it could be, it's not working. The change that we're implementing is not working. We need to go back to the drawing board and figure out, okay, what am I going to do different in the next step? So that's what we mean by a feedback loop. So here's the action research cycle in more detail. And you can see each step. The first step starts with a diagnosis of the problem. What is really the problem that we initially see? And usually this problem is discussed with an OD consultant. So a manager within the organization might call on an OD consultant to help him diagnose what they think the problem is. And then the OD consultant will do data gathering and do a preliminary diagnosis. So in other words, he will ask the organization members to find out, okay, what do you think the problem is? He'll gather data. He might look at company records to see, the sales data. Is it going up? Is it going down? Which might, in fact, point to the reason why there is a problem in the first place. So after we do the data gathering, the OD consultant may go back to his client. So a client is, in other words, the manager who has hired the OD consultant. And he might give information based on the initial data that he has gathered. Based on that, he moves on and he does a meeting with his client, and with the basis of the information that they've gathered, they make a joint decision. They make a joint diagnosis to find out, okay, guys, this is what we need to do to fix our problem. And there's a joint action and planning, and then an action is made. And after you implement the change, and to see whether the change is actually working, we again do data gathering. We do another survey. We ask people, are you satisfied with what you're experiencing? And then that data, we feed that back to the client. And we tell the client, okay, based on our first steps, this is what we are experiencing. In the case of CIC, we're now implementing online learning. And what we might do in the near future is to ask you students, how are you feeling about this online learning environment? How can we improve in delivering this online learning process? Whatever feedback you give us, perhaps you might say, we want more videos, or we want shorter videos. We'll use that information to go back to the drawing board, to go back to the planning, and come up with a better solution, or a better next steps. Okay. Okay. The positive model, as it sort of suggests, focuses on a positive approach to plan change. So unlike the previous models, like the Lewin's model, that focuses on what is not working, the positive model looks at, okay, what is working, what is our strength as an organization, and then we build on that. So in other words, that's what we focus on. We don't focus on the problem and fixing the problem. We're focusing on what are we doing right, and we'll use that to create change within the organization. So an example of this is, let's look at why customers are satisfied with their services, and then we'll build on that. Let's not look at why customers are angry at us, or why customers are complaining about our products. So that's just another type of approach. Now, positive model is also highly participative. In other words, it gains a lot of input coming from employees. And lastly, employees are more motivated to make this change happen using this positive model, because it's a very positive approach. We are not looking at employees and telling them, you know, you didn't do well, you know, you did this mistake and you shouldn't have done that. It's almost like a child. When we raise a child, positive reinforcement is more effective most of the time, as opposed to negative punishment. So if you tell a child, this is good, you're doing very well, this is what you did correctly, and I want you to do more of that, that is very positive reinforcement to the child. Same thing with an employee. If you point out the right things that he's doing, he's going to want to do that again and again. So that is the whole approach to positive model. Okay, the positive model also has 4 stages, as illustrated here. Another word, by the way, for positive model is called the appreciative inquiry. And the first stage of this positive model is discovering, you know, what is it that we are proud of? What is it that we believe we are very strong within this organization? And then the next stage then is, okay, this is where we are, these are our strengths. Where do we want to take the organization? What's our vision? What do we want this organization to be? So it's almost like a goal that we are trying to create. So yes, we are good, but we want to be even better. How much more do we want to be? You know, twice the sales, 50% less expenses, whatever it is. That's basically a dream or a goal that we want to discuss. And usually this whole process, by the way, is participative. We get the employees involved in meetings usually, and we ask them these questions. what do we want to become? And after we determine what our goal is, then we start designing how do we achieve that goal? What are the things that we need to do in order for us to achieve these goals? And lastly, delivering. After we've designed and planned out what steps we need to take, we now have to actually take these steps. And more importantly, we need to measure how well we are doing. So again, it is very similar to action research in the sense that we look at what we are doing and seeing whether it's effective or not. We are measuring it. For example, if we want to change the number of, or we want to improve the product quality, we might be focused on how many defects do we have with our product, and therefore we measure how many defects do we have in our product for every 1,000 manufacturing products that we've manufactured. So if we are bringing down the number of defects, it means that we are actually improving the quality of our product. And that's what we mean by measuring the effectivity of what we are delivering. Okay, this is just a slide which compares so far the three models that we've talked about. We've started with Lewin's change model, which is basically just 3 stages: unfreeze, move, and refreeze. The action research has several steps involved, but if you really look at it, you can divide these stages more or less according to Lewin's model. So problem identification, consulting with an OD expert, gathering information, all of this can be part of what we call the unfreeze stage. And then when we diagnose the problem, when we're actually moving towards making a change, that would be part of movement. And looking at how well we've done is actually part of refreezing. Same thing with the positive model. The first stage of initiating the inquiry would be part of the unfreeze. Inquiring into best practice would still be within the unfreezing part. Discovering themes and envisioning, creating a goal, and designing to deliver ways would all be part of the movement stage. So again, I'm just pointing out that although these models look very different, they're actually quite similar. They stem from the basic Lewin's plan model. A relatively newer model that's come out in the environment now is what we call the ProSci-ADCAR model. And although there's a lot of things being said here, I will just sort of say that this is actually quite similar to, again, Lewin's model. However, there's more than 3 stages. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stages involved. And the first stage is what we call the awareness stage, where people become aware of the change that they need to implement. And then hopefully, if you're the change management consultant, what you're trying to do is create a desire. We want employees to actually want to change. They want them to realize, okay, I need to do this, and I need to do it because if I don't, I will be left behind. So a great example, again, is learning how to learn online. If you don't have the desire to go online, if you don't have the desire to learn Zoom, then you're not going to be able to change. You need to have that desire, okay? And that desire stems from the awareness stage. So I will tell you, well, you need to learn how to go online because the alternative is you might get sick with the virus. So I tell you, that's the consequence. That might happen to you. And okay, then that drives you to learn something new. The next stage is knowledge. So knowledge means that at this stage, employees already have the awareness, they already have the desire to change. Now, maybe at this stage, they don't know how to change. So if you're willing to go online, but you don't know how to use Zoom, or you don't know how to use any of the available software, then you are at that stage where you don't have that knowledge to change. You already have the awareness, you need to change, you need to go online because of the coronavirus. You have the desire, you want to go online, but you don't know how to use the software. So that's a perfect example of not having the knowledge to make the change. And if you were in that stage, obviously the name of the game or the objective of the change consultant is to train you on how to use these tools. How do you use Zoom? How do you use Moodle? How do you pause the video so that you can learn more? How do you speed up the video? All of those little things that would be the advantages of being online, you need to learn and create that knowledge for you. Now, um, now, suppose you've learned how to do all of these things. You already have the knowledge. The next is the ability. This is closely associated with knowledge, except for the fact that sometimes we do have the knowledge, but we don't necessarily have the ability because we've never tried it before. I can teach you how to go online. I can teach you how to use Zoom, but if you've never used it before, you might be wondering, okay, how do I actually use this software? So ability is quite important in the change model. So even if you've got the knowledge, if you're not using that knowledge, then you're not actually affecting change. So assuming we've gained that stage, the next and last stage is what we call reinforcement. Now that you've learned this new system, now that you learned how to go online and use Zoom, the next difficulty will be, how do you make sure that that becomes a habit? How do we make sure that you're actually going online at say 3:30, or sorry, our class is 12:30. So every Wednesday and Thursday, you come at 12:30, because some people forget. They've learned how to do something, but they've forgotten basically how to use it. So if you don't have that reinforcement, then you don't develop the habit. That's basically the ProSci-ADKAR model. And if you notice, it's really very similar to the, what do you call this? The Lewin's model. Awareness and desire stage of ADKAR is very much the unfreeze stage. Having the knowledge and the ability is what you need to do movement. And reinforcement stage is really the same as refreeze stage of Lewin. The key difference between ADKAR and Lewin is the fact that ADKAR uses a diagnostic tool. I don't know if I've got that slide there. Yeah, so basically, as I was saying, the ProSci-ADKAR model is quite similar to Lewin, but its stages are more detailed. So you can see from the previous slide, unfreeze here is described as having awareness and the desire to make that change. So you can see that it has a little bit more detail in exactly what we're supposed to do in that particular stage. Some of the similarities between the other models include change is almost always preceded by a diagnosis or a preparatory stage. So in other words, we're trying to figure out what's the problem first before we start implementing a change. That's really important. At the end of the day, if you're analyzing a situation, you need to know what the problem is, and you have to be very good at diagnosing what's the problem, because it's no use implementing or trying to suggest a solution if you have the problem all wrong. So in fact, we're going to be practicing that in this class. You're going to have an assignment, and part of that is a case study, which you need to detect the problem of the case study. Okay, so most of those models involve the members in the change process. In other words, it's very participative. You get members to help you plan the change process. And most of these models have an evaluation at the end of each process. So if you look at the ProSci-ADKAR model, in order for you to reinforce, which is the last stage, you need to be measuring how well are people actually implementing the change. Same thing with the action research model. It actually has a stage where you're looking and re-diagnosing whether the change that you're trying to implement is actually holding fast and it's actually being implemented. Key differences of the models include the role of the organizational development specialist or the consultant. Lewin's model will focus more on a descriptive process of the plan change. It describes how people are basically moving through that stage. but the other models can tend to give a little bit more description of what the OD specialist is supposed to do for every single stage of that model. The difference between the 3 or 4 models versus the positive model is the fact that the positive model builds on strengths, while the other approaches build on problems. ProSci-ADCAR model, as I was saying earlier, it uses a diagnostic tool. What it does is you do a survey of every employee that is involved in the change, and you ask them, you give them some questions which helps us determine at what stage they're in. So an example, ProSci-ADCAR, I might do a survey and I find out that Billy, one of our employees, already has the awareness, already has the desire, already has the knowledge to do the change, but perhaps he just doesn't have the ability yet. So at that point, we can say Billy is at the ability stage. So as an OD specialist, we need to design interventions or design activities that can help Billy build his ability to make that change, like learning the new software, learning the new procedure, for example. As opposed to another person in the organization, maybe Wally, and Wally is aware that he needs to change, but he has no desire. So if you compare Billy and Wally, Wally is over here in the desire stage, while Billy is several stage more ahead. He's ahead of the other person. And therefore, the kind of intervention we should design for Billy will be quite different from Wally. Wally being in a more advanced stage, then we can basically just help him develop that ability. But as opposed to the other employee who is still in the desire stage, we will sort of need to motivate him to bring him outside of that basically resistance to change mode where he still doesn't want to change and get him further down the stage. So what that really means, the ProSci-ADCAR model is quite developed because, can move on. The OD consultant using this model and the diagnostic tool can actually address the unique demands and unique issues that face each employee. So it's really a highly recommended change model to use. The last approach that we can talk about in change management is Dunphy and Stace's contingency approach to change management. Basically, Dunphy and Stace criticize the use of action research, Ewan's model, because what they're saying is these are all fixed processes to effect change. They are a standard process. And what they're saying is each situation is quite different. And therefore, we should develop a model based on whatever the situation demands. So as mentioned here, the theory is situational. We need to achieve an optimum fit depending on the situation of the organization. Basically, their model uses 2 aspects of change, or 2 dimensions of change. The first stage is what we call the scale of change. So in other words, how big a change do we need to have? Do we need a transformational change that affects the entire organization? Or are we just talking about one small unit in the organization that just needs to change, and perhaps an accounting system? And it could be a minor, it only involves maybe 5 people. So that's what we mean, a big change versus a small change. The other thing we need to consider is what kind of management style do we need to affect this change? Do we need a very dictatorial, a very authoritative, no questions asked type of leadership style, very driven? Or do we need a more collaborative, a more participative approach to affecting that change? So this is a dimension, basically a dimensional image that shows us how we plot those 2 aspects of change. As I said, the first aspect is the amount or the nature of change that we need. Do we need a transformation, or do we need just a simple fine-tuning of change? The other dimension or axis would be the type of management style that would be needed. Are we more of a coercive type of a leader? Do we need a coercive style of leader? So coercive means that we are using threats and we're using punishment as our way of effecting change. Similar to a leader saying, look, you have no choice. You have to do this change or you will resign or I'll fire you. So that's a very coercive type of approach, as opposed to a very collaborative approach, which is more about getting people to come together and make a decision as a group. So each of these aspects can dictate basically that's the style of change model that we can use depending again on the particular situation. So for example, if we need a big transformation, for example, the Kodak case, Kodak needed to transform itself from a film company into a digital company that worked on memories of people and of basically a more socially based organization, then that would mean a complete transformation of the way they're doing business. So that would be in this quadrant over here. Now, how do you want to effect that change? What kind of style would be appropriate? Now, if you're faced with a crisis and you need to change very quickly, then I would think that a dictatorial transformation would be more appropriate, because you should use coercive style because you have no choice. You have to make a change. That change has to be done very quickly. Otherwise, the company will have to be bankrupt and close. Now, it could be, on the other hand, it could be just a minor change that involves only a small department, in which case, if you're using a directive or coercive style, that's more of a forced evolution. You're forcing people to do it, as opposed to a participative evolution, which is you're getting people to participate and collaborate to come up with solutions to this issue, the issues that they're facing or the problems that they're facing. So what do you use depends on the situation. And as indicated here, use a participative evolution. If the organization is in fit, in other words, they're working well, there's a lot of teamwork going on, people like each other, but then you need very minor adjustment in the way you do business. And there are a lot of groups within the organization that already favor the change. So therefore, you don't have to be dictatorial. You can get people to evolve. The timing is not so important. You can do meetings and ask people to participate in coming out with a solution. On the other hand, if it's a transformation that is needed, but then perhaps the culture does not take to what they call this, to very coercive style of leadership, then you might want to try a charismatic transformation. And as seen here, that would be in this quadrant. And charismatic transformations are used when an organization is out of fit with its environment. In other words, it needs to have a dramatic change because it can't really deal with the challenges of the environment. Again, a great example would be Kodak. And if there's already some support for change from within the organization, then yes, you could do a charismatic transformation. In other words, people already have the desire to change. And in that case, then a charismatic transformation might be more suitable. A forced evolution, on the other hand, is when an organization is fit, but it just needs a minor adjustment. And there is a little bit of opposition from subcultures within the organization. Dictatorial transformation is the most strict kind. It's the most coercive, and of course, when you need a radical change. So when the organization needs a radical change to survive, and then there is no support from within, obviously you need a very strong hand to require change, because if you don't change, then you don't survive. Okay, that's the end of our mini lecture for for today. So go back to your class. If you're viewing this as part of a live session, then please go back to the Zoom meeting and then await instructions from your instructor.